multiple barriers, from the job description and how the job description is written and how direct and clear that job description is, really through to then the interview process. So many challenges during that interview process, especially for, well, I'm thinking from a neurodivergent lens here.
Yeah.
But, things like how questions are asked, that no questions aren't provided in advance. So being able to overcome that barrier is probably one of the biggest challenges. Interviews are all about playing the game, aren't they? So you go along to the interview, the good people that get the role are often just good at playing the game effectively, understanding exactly how they should answer the question and being able to interpret what the interviewer needs to hear. And quite often that's probably where neurodivergent people really struggle. One of the kind of more relevant aspects now is the return to the office.
Yeah.
Really, really a massive struggle, I think, for many people, but also the lack of clarity in job descriptions around that. So often you see job descriptions that say it's remote, but actually within that job description there is, it is remote, but you need to be in the office 2 days a week, you need to come in for 2 days of training, you need to come into meetings. So if that isn't a
fully
position,
remote work, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think we're kind of, while we did make progress, we're kind of going back slightly now with the lack of clarity in job descriptions and then the interview piece.
Well, I think as well, I find that when you go to many, like, I'm just talking like just off the top of my head, with many organisations or many businesses or companies, they want their workers in the office, they want their people in the office, and it just, unfortunately, just because of people's circumstances, not to any fault of their own or because they want to, but just because of their circumstances, that doesn't actually work for them. It doesn't really cater to them. So then it does mean that they have to then bend their pretty much like work for their work rather than their work working for them, if that makes sense. So I guess that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, but I think there's also the area of businesses being really clear with themselves of why they want people to return to the office. Many times they'll say, it's about productivity.
Yeah.
So we need people in the office because we want to increase productivity. We know innovation happens when people are together, that we have those conversations. But actually, having that presenteeism aspect doesn't necessarily relate to increased productivity, to increased innovation. Many people actually, without having, especially from a neurodivergent lens specifically, without having to think about the environment they're in, having that sensory overload, that sensory overwhelm, having to have those multiple conversations, that actually reduces productivity in the office. So I think many times businesses are kind of going to this return to office mandate, but not necessarily being clear with themselves what they're hoping to achieve by doing that and having that flexibility. For some people, being in an office is amazing and it does improve productivity, but for others it doesn't. So being really flexible and thinking more about, am I wanting presenteeism or am I wanting the work to be done to an amazing standard, and trying to balance the two?
Yeah, no, I get that. But so from your experience coaching both individuals and organisations, where do you think the biggest disconnect currently probably exists between like employers and neurodivergent people?
Oh my God, that's such a big question. I think it's like, that is a huge question, Nikki. And I think it all comes down to communication.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that communication in terms of a neurodivergent person needing to kind of adapt their communication, but there seems to be a need, and I sort of think about myself as more like a translator. There needs to be that translation between how, if you're neurodivergent, you can talk to the employer and ask for what you need and be empowered to ask for what you need. Equally, the employer needs someone to translate what they can be doing to put in place to support their teams, their neurodivergent employees. And often, I'd say often, at times you see the neurodivergent employee maybe disclosing and expecting then the employer to know what to do or be able to do things quite quickly. And equally, the employer's thinking, well, you've disclosed to me, you tell me what you need. So there can sometimes be that impasse of, they kind of get stuck at that point of not being able to effectively advocate for their needs and lead the conversation, but equally employers feel worried about doing the wrong thing and then maybe do nothing at all. So really that need for translation, I think, between the two. From an individual point of view, kind of what my support looks at is not just around strategies in work, because strategies in work are only sustainable if you have strategies in life. So often I've supported so many people, and we've been going through, looking at executive functioning, looking at strategies, implementing strategies. Actually, the barrier to someone being able to implement those strategies is having the capacity to implement them. And often people won't have that capacity because they've already reached burnout, they've got to overwhelmed state, their home life is quite chaotic and they haven't got the strategies there. So if one area of your life isn't supported, it's really difficult to support the other area and vice versa.
Well, I think it's like quite psychological, which actually leads into my next question actually, because I was going to ask you, how important do you think confidence and psychological safety are for neurodivergent people in the workplace? Because you said it is about kind of balancing everything all together. And if there's one aspect or one area in your life that isn't working the way it should be, then everything else kind of falls. It's like a cog in a machine. So how important do you think confidence and psychological safety are for neurodivergent people in the workplace?
I think psychological safety is, paramount importance, especially when disclosing to your employer. So, for example, I've worked in the area of neurodivergence now for over 20 years. I was late identified ADHD at 35 when, I had a baby, we were in lockdown, all of my strategies that I'd put in place just crumbled around me. Even after working in the field for so long and talking to employers and advising other people, it was still really hard to disclose. And I think, psychological safety isn't just about having good policies and talking a lot. It's actually about the actions that, actions speak louder than words. So you can have all the policy documentation, but if the actions don't go alongside that, it's going to be really, really hard. So it's not necessarily saying, oh, well, you've told a HR person, say, well, you've told me you've got ADHD, now let's tell your manager. That first step of telling somebody that might be in HR, might be a colleague, was a big enough step. And sometimes we try and rush someone through disclosure rather than helping them or supporting them to understand what that diagnosis means for them. Because all of a sudden, their viewpoint of who they are, they're trying to make sense of everything that they've struggled with, now is under a label, but then that's changing who they are as well. So who am I now after that diagnosis? So I know that's a really long-winded way of answering that question, but psychological safety is kind of key, I think, to encouraging that disclosure.
Well, I was actually going to kind of counter off that, because would you say that was I wouldn't say mistake, but my next question was going to be, what are some big mistakes or the biggest mistakes companies make? So would you say that's also a mistake during not so much the hiring process, but the inclusive part of the workplace culture?
I think so. I think what organisations often do is they'll have, okay, we've got a policy for this. So we've got a policy for how we want to hire from diverse backgrounds. So we'll have this policy for doing that. They might write that into their job description, but there'll be certain points within that process that will either signify somebody going into a positive culture and starting to feel like they could be psychologically safe, that businesses are missing. So if a business says they are a diverse employer and want applications from neurodivergent employees and disabled employees, then actually what they need to also be doing is ensuring they have guidelines that they can send out with that job application. Like, this is so some of the things I talk to employees about doing is have something that says, if you disclose, this is what we can do. Here's some accommodations we can immediately implement. Here's somebody you can talk to about that. So by giving all of that information up front, you're being really transparent. And I think for many neurodivergent and disabled people looking for work, they've probably seen so many times, oh, I'm a diverse employer, and had a bad experience.
Yeah.
Just by saying that doesn't necessarily help people to start to feel psychologically safe. But if you then provide more information and case studies and links and show it in action that people can actually see, you will then start to encourage, one, more applications from diverse employees, two, higher rates of disclosure, and three, the retention of staff when they get there, which is kind of what all businesses want, right?
Yeah, and do you know what I think as well, with a lot of, I find with recruitment agencies, it's more just they want to get people employed rather than actually keeping the retention. And yeah, okay, it might work for recruitment agencies because they get their commission, but in terms of businesses, they lose money because they're having to constantly find people to replace. You know, they'll go through about 4 or 5 different people for one job role because it doesn't actually fit their needs. So from the things that you've just said, like, from your perspective, do you think those little changes in recruitment could change or immediately make some sort of process to make this more accessible for people who are neurodivergent or people who have got disabilities or people with chronic illnesses?
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those changes are really important. I think if you're looking at in-house recruitment teams, then absolutely make some of those changes. I suppose this is the same for in-house recruitment and staffing agencies. Making those changes are really important, but also reaching your audience is another thing that isn't necessarily happening. So like you said, like everything, especially from a recruitment agency point of view, turnover is so fast that they're not necessarily building that pipeline and that audience for where people that are neurodivergent or disabled people are that can find out about those roles. And that's the piece as well that's missing. We're expecting people to find us, yet we're not meeting people where they are.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the key pieces of advice, if there's anybody that would hear this that's within a staffing organisation, is diversify where you're looking for talent. Don't just rely on, your generic job boards. Don't just rely on LinkedIn. Meet people where they're going to be and where they're going to find out about work.
Yeah. So what advice would you actually give to someone who is like neurodivergent, who feels overlooked or discouraged in their career journey?
Oh, gosh, that's also... do you know what? It's easy to say, which everyone does, like, don't worry, it will happen for you. And I think actually that's what can be really disempowering, and you're not validating somebody's actual experience of where they are. I think my one piece of advice is reach out to people that you can have a conversation with. Like I'm happy to have conversations with anybody to see where they are in their career journey and point them in the right direction. So there is a lot of places out there that can provide support and advice and guidance to you. I think the other thing I would say is really, I'm not going to say disclose because it's a really personal, it's a really personal choice to disclose. But what I would say is, if you're still unsure whether to or not, really write down, if you can, all of the strengths that your neurodivergence or disability brings, and start to create like that profile for you. So rather than just thinking about disclosure when you're talking to an employer or potential employer about, okay, I've got ADHD, which means I'm going to be rubbish at this, and this, think about it in changing the narrative of, okay, I've got ADHD, I can bring this to the table, and how you can support me to succeed and get the best from me is by doing this, this, and this. So think of it more in really practical terms. So you might want, if you've got ADHD, to meetings at the end of the day to always have your camera off.
Yeah.
If you're asking for, really be specific in what you're asking for, because that will help the employer know then what to do next. That's, again, a really long-winded way of answering that question, Nikki.
No, it makes sense, because I think it's very, like, it's all about, like, perspective almost. If you change the perspective on the way you see things, it's looked at less as, you know, if you look at things from a negative lens, you're only going to see the negative. You look at things from a positive lens, you're only going to see it from a positive way. And I feel like when people say they suffer with ADHD or ADD or they've got autism or anything like, I feel like internally they see it as like, okay, that's a detriment to me and I'm not going to get any further in my career. But really, it's just about how you change the perspective. Just because with whatever it is that you've been diagnosed with, it doesn't actually necessarily mean that you're going to be any better or less than anyone else who hasn't got a...
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. So it's easy, it's an easy thing, isn't it, to say, okay, let's, you know, start to see things through a positive lens. So will be so unbelievably difficult for many people to do. Is that, you know, if I think, again, through a neurodivergent lens, you know, for many, like, autistic people, for many people with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette, you know, everything within that, they've experienced so many negative comments, they've experienced so many situations where they've been told they've got it wrong, but haven't been told what the rules are. So getting to that point where you can change and see it in a more positive lens it's a work in progress and it's a journey. And I think part of that journey, especially part of that journey for me and other people that I've spoken to, is finding out from people that have been in your situation, you know, connect with other people that, you know, if you've got ADHD, connect with other people that have got ADHD, follow people that have ADHD and are a coach or provide support on LinkedIn, because there's so much stuff out there that once you start to recognise yourself in others, that can start to shift the balance from seeing things through a negative lens to start to be on that journey to see things through that positive lens.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. I do see that. So if you could change one thing about modern workplace culture, then what would that be?
Your questions are like huge. Like,
getting very philosophical, questions.
Massive. If I could only pick one thing,
or many things, it doesn't have to necessarily be one thing, but just things for you personally, like if you could change things about like traditional workplace culture where you feel like it would benefit everyone, what do you think it would be?
So this is a really small one, really simple. I was doing some training the other day, and this was one of the things I said the most and was like, please do this. If there was one really easy thing that I would say in work tomorrow, that if anyone's listening to this, any employers, that they would do and it would have a direct impact, is never putting a meeting in without an agenda.
Yeah.
Never randomly Teams message somebody out of the blue to say, can we jump on a quick call, because that will send someone into the doom spiral that, you know, they're going to lose their job and their life is over. And the third one is follow up everything with notes and writing. So, you know, if you've had that meeting, put everything into writing afterwards. And those three things, while so simple, they have such an impact on somebody's day, because it reduces anxiety, which then reduces overwhelm, which then goes towards someone feeling psychologically safe. So even if you don't know somebody is neurodivergent or disabled and needs those things, doing it as standard practice helps create that culture and that psychological safety that people need to start feeling in the business, and also just is generally good practice, because how many people on back-to-back meetings finish a meeting and then completely forget?
Yeah, no, naturally.
So I think it helps everyone.
No, do you know what? That's really insightful, actually. I wasn't even thinking that. I thought it'd be more as in like the workplace itself, how to like make it more accessible. I'm thinking more from like a disabled candidate point of view, but I never even thought of that. That's actually a very good point and very insightful.